I am Dr. Gabriela Baeza Ventura. I'm professor in the Department of Hispanic Studies and Deputy Director at Arte Público Press and co-director of the US Latino Digital Humanities Center at the University of Houston. On behalf of Arte Público, Recovering the US Hispanic Literary Heritage Program and USLDH, we welcome you to this talk. As many of you know, APP and Recovery, two important forces in the field of US Latino studies, were founded by Dr. Nicolás Canelos, a recent recipient of the National Medal for the Humanities. His vision to establish a nonprofit press and a historical archival program stemmed from a social justice need to document the legacy of Latina and Latino culture, language, and literature in the United States. To date, APP has published over 700 books, fiction, nonfiction, including YA and children's literature, and Recovery. And I'm happy to see that we have some of our Recovery board members here, Clara, Ana, Kenya, and I may not, and Monse, has located over 1,500 newspapers and digitized thousands of records that document the presence of the Latino people in the land that we now know as the United States. The social justice need continues to this day as we fight against the erasure of our bodies and language on a daily basis. Therefore, the need to create a center that could use these resources for digital scholarship was and is imminent now more than ever. My colleague, Dr. Carolina Villarroel, Brown Foundation Director of Research at Recovery, and I began the US Latino Digital Humanities Center 7 years ago with the generous support of the Mellon Foundation. And we are happy to report that we have made important strides in the field. We have grown our team to include our dear Dr. Lorena Gothero, our digital programs manager. And together we organize talks and workshops in digital humanities, DH and social justice, present at conferences across the US, train and mentor students and faculty from all academic levels, K through 12 to and beyond, as well as community members on US Latino praxis, DH praxis, create digital projects and data sets, and constantly look and apply for all grants possible to bring in internships to continue to foster opportunities for mentorship and training and for collaboration. We have awarded over 25 grants in aid, and we are so happy for that, for US Latino Digital Humanities projects and training. And this has solidified the USLDH mission to continue working and supporting research on US Latina and Latino written legacy. I invite you to visit our website, artepublicopress.com, for more information, to follow us on social media, and to use the hashtag USLDH, hashtag USLDH, to share information on our lectures and about anything related to US Latino Digital Humanities. We continue to gather that information and to create data sets that help us document for foundations the work that is happening by scholars all over the nation. When we first applied for the first Mellon grant, we were told that there was no interest in digital humanities by Latinos, and we have moved beyond that. Now there are centers, right? We have our center, and there's another center that's being built in San Antonio on digital humanities and border studies. So we've done a lot of work. Before I introduce our presenters, I would like to go over a couple of logistics for our Q&A. We invite you all to use the function, the chat function, to type your questions or comments. After all the presentations have been done, you will be invited to ask questions by unmuting yourselves, or if you like, Lorena or I can read the question to our presenters. So without further ado, we're gonna go ahead and jump into presentations. I will we will follow the order that as it was advertised. So we'll start with Sarah, then we'll continue with Christofer, and then end with Ana. So the title of the first presentation is Nuestra Historia, a public art and public history project in Ybor City, Florida. And this is being delivered by Sarah McNamara from Texas A&M University. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to share my screen with you all. but let's see if I'm more advanced than I am sometimes when I am giving a presentation in a classroom. Here we go. That's where I get it correctly. All right. Okay, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. I know that we're at the end of the semester, and I don't know if you've had the line of students out your door, but I have. It has been, it's relieving to be here to share a bit of the other type of work that we all do over the course of the entire year. So my project title, which Gabriela, I should have told you, it's now Nuestras Historias. It is in the plural in part because I needed a URL and Nuestra Historia was taken. So how the process of doing this project changes things. But there's more behind that as well. But it's Nuestras Historias, a public history and public art project in Ybor City, Florida. So to begin the project and description of this, I want to share with you all a little bit about Ybor City. While we think about Florida as a place where Latinidad lives and where we imagine that we know so much, we're oftentimes pinpointing stories specifically that look at places that are most visible, like Miami and a post-1959 generation of migration. But my work stems from examining an earlier migration and thinking about Florida as a place that is endemically defined by Latinidad, as well as one that has multiple political perspectives and ideas of self that collide within one space and that also fight for memory. So to give you all a little background, Ybor City is located in and near Tampa. It's not near Miami. So I'm telling a story that is beginning in a different location. This is an image from an old map that's part of the plant system. Ybor City is located right near where my cursor is, where you can see Tampa in big bold letters. So it is on the west coast of Florida, and it was originally a small cigar working town that was defined by the movement and the migration of the cigar industry out of Cuba during the wars for independence. And as cigar manufacturers sought to find a location where they thought that they could both control labor and maximize profit. So, with that in mind, Ybor City in Tampa is not the original location of the US born or the not US born of the US located cigar industry. It was initially Key West. And if we keep that map in mind, that was due to a very logical reason. Key West is very close to Cuba. It was very close to Havana. It was very easy to move both people and goods. And that was the reason why this was the initial location. However, like I said, cigar manufacturers, one of the things that they found or that they believed or that they hoped, according to the way that stories are told among community members, is that they looked for ways to control both workers and their movement. In the midst of the Cuban Wars for Independence, one thing about the Cuban cigar industry and the Cuban cigar workers specifically was that they moved between the island and between work and Key West. They were involved in a part of revolution making in both places, and political work was as much a part of their labor as the labor that they did themselves. So they were vehemently radical and they were involved in envisioning what a different kind of life would look like and what a different and independent nation could be. So one of the things that cigar manufacturers thought, they enjoyed the production that was stateside because they were able to maximize their profits. It was cheaper to import raw goods, so Cuban tobacco to Florida, which could not be produced in Florida or in the United States. They did try to produce in Florida and to export a manufactured good out of the United States that was cheaper than exporting the manufactured good out of Key West. So in the midst of these problems, right, they know that they want to keep the cigar industry here in the United States, but they need a different location, or that's what they believe. So they begin looking. And they define that, right, in Tampa, and Ybor City is the initial location. So some of these images here, they are photographs that live within the University of South Florida's special collections that has a rich availability of different items that tell this history. Many of them are from the Burgert Brothers collection, which makes the process of building a digital repository and digital storytelling connected to Nuestras Historias very useful because they are all open access. They're high quality images that were done by a duo of photographers who were brothers who documented the development of Tampa from the turn of the century through mid-century. So some of these images here, they give you a good idea of what Ybor City looked like during its earliest period. Right? It was one that had an infrastructure. You can see the trolley that is moving through. There was company housing, both seen through the bottom right corner, and you can also see them in the background of the larger aerial view, and images of what labor looked like during an earlier period. And so one of the portions of Ybor City, and the reality is that they've tried to make Ybor City, manufacturers specifically, tried to make it a place where people would go and stay. So things like company housing were a part of the development of the community, as were different forms of, as I noted, infrastructure from grocery stores to transportation to community spaces that would encourage people to come and to stay, and that they also knew that they were competing with other locations. Right. The other thing to keep in mind is that within Ybor City, there was also a community-based infrastructure that was built. Here I have two different images on display of mutual aid societies, or as they're locally termed, centros. On the right is the Siglo Cubano. That is which still exists today and it still stands, the Cuban Club. And on the left-hand side is the third location of what was called the Labor Temple, or the Centro Obrero. This building to the left stands as well. The building on the right is a part of a system of mutual aid that existed within the community. And there were different mutual aid societies for the different immigrant populations that were within Ybor City. So you had groups of Sicilians and Italians, groups of Spaniards, some who came from northern Spain, others who came from other regions. So you had both the Centro Español and the Centro Estudiano. And then also, right, clubs for Cubans. Initially, there was one Cuban mutual aid society. Following Ybor City's incorporation into broader Hillsborough County, this was broken up into two different mutual aid societies. So the Siglo Cubano, which was specifically for Cubans with lighter complexion, so white Cubans, whereas the Sociedad Martí Maceo was the club for Afro-Cubans. So the form of US-based segregation comes to play a role within the community, not just by imposing those principles, but also over time, people within the community adhering to them and also adopting them for their own forms. So there was a network of how these things operated. But the other thing that I worked to call attention to is that one of the things that was a part of Ybor City is that it was also this space where there was an international collision of intellectual processes, where people who were thinkers from across the Caribbean, South America, from Europe, collided within Ybor City as they exchanged ideas, as they mobilized different politics, and as they were part of different movement making. While we oftentimes think of the Cuban War of Independence as this defining moment, because it absolutely was in Ybor City. People like in the middle I have here, which I promise that the photo is more high res than it looks here, but it is a picture of El Parque de José Martí, which is the park that pays homage to José Martí and his memory within Ybor City. He came to visit Ybor a couple times during the midst of revolution making in order to mobilize cigar workers and also collect money. I have a picture on the right of Luisa Capetillo, who was the author of one of the first feminist treaties of feminism from the region. And I believe there are two great Arte Público books on she and her writings, if you all have republished them with excellent intros by different scholars. I have a student each semester who ends up writing about her using those books and those sources, who came and lived and worked in Ybor City. She republished her book, Mi Opinión, following her time within Ybor City, revising it based on her experiences within the community. And there's also a strong and a long newspaper tradition. I have two images over here of La Gaceta and La Traducción, two different papers. La Gaceta was emerged from within the community, and La Traducción did as well. La Traducción, it also translated different newspapers and different articles from other areas directly. And La Gaceta it still is in existence today as a trilingual newspaper, the only one in the United States, and is still owned by the original family. Right. So this exchange of ideas and intellectualism was as much a part of Ybor City as was labor. And understanding these things and thinking about them and remembering them is essential to remembering what this place was, but it's easily forgotten for many reasons. By the time that Ybor City enters the late 1940s and early 1950s, the post-World War II era and the rise of the Cold War leads to a suppression of different kinds of politics, as well as people seeking to find a way for Ybor City to remain relevant. The draw of the Cuban cigar industry, it began to wane during the Great Depression because the product was expensive, employment was expensive, and also mechanization began to take center stage in different forms. And the broader industry of Tampa diversified in different ways following World War II, especially with the relocation of things like MacDill Air Force Base and the expansion of the city, and worked to attract different types of industry. Ybor City looked for, and those who lived within it looked for different ways to redefine themselves, and did it in a way where they embraced a form of Latinidad that seemed as acceptable, imbibable, and consumable to other people, where it repressed the ideas of what were the radical politics that made the place and accommodated to the decisions that people made along the way, from softening their approach from accepting different forms of racist policies to using them to their advantage, to becoming or working to become a part of a majority. So in the midst of this, there's also different programs that change the landscape of what Ybor City is and what it was. It once encompassed, in its majority, up to 200 acres on the eastern outskirts of Hillsborough County. And by the time that we are looking at the 1950s, much of that area had been redlined. And by the 1960s and 1970s, urban renewal redefined the boundaries of it by taking Interstate 275 and demolishing many of the buildings and the pieces of infrastructure that existed there. So one of the portions of this is how to translate a story. So the story that I just told you is one that is the basic background of what Ybor City is, or when we think about it, or why we should remember it, right? Thinking about a sense of Latinidad and also Cubanness that reaches beyond what is most readily available or at the forefront of our minds from within newspapers and headlines and different reporting. In my book, Ybor City, I tell the story of Ybor City from its inception through the end, through urban renewal, asking us to think about how people over the course of multiple generations redefine themselves in relationship to both international politics and things that are happening on the ground, in an effort to make the choices that they make understandable and also human. The portion of the book that I found myself wondering is, once it was done, to be quite honest, I was on a walk and I was thinking, it's one thing to write an academic book, and it's one thing for we as scholars to know that it exists or to tell the story. But the question becomes, how can this be translated for a broader and a mass audience? And that is where the idea for Nuestras Historias emerged. So Nuestras Historias, the public history and public art project, I began working on this in 2020, thinking of it as, how can I break down the primary lessons of my book into potentially 5 different sites in order to translate this story to a broader public? If anybody were walking down the street, how could they learn this story? And what I began to think about was the duality of both historical markers and artwork and how those two things can work together. In Ybor City, this plays an important role and it also builds on its history. Ybor City has had many redefinitions over time, many different uses and reasons for the community. But one between the 1980s and 1990s was that it became a haven for artists. It became a place where punk music and where different kinds of art crafts were done. And it still exists in some ways, or trying to reemerge as a district based on art. The historical story told within it, however, is very watered down. It is the narrative that emerged following that end of the 1950s period. So I wanted to tell a story that foregrounds politics and that doesn't shy away from the radicalness that made the space. So in order to do this, Nuestra Historias is a collaboration between different entities. So first, I created community partnerships via collaboration with the City of Tampa Division of Arts and Culture, the City of Tampa Division of Archives, and the Hillsborough County Historical Commission. All three of those entities work together in order to work with me as I identify sites of locations, thinking about walkability, and also one of the criteria for me is that I will not do a site that is not historically accurate. So if there is a marker that is going in a location in a piece of artwork, it's not just because a wall is available or there's space. It is that the thing that I am noting happened in that location. And the way that I present about it and talk about it when I'm before different stakeholders within the community is that what we're working to do is to create landmarks that help us remember what the community was and how it was defined on its own terms and based on things that we can no longer see. Because it's great when a building still exists, but it's different when the majority of what made Latinidad in a certain space can no longer be seen. Right? So that is what it's working to do. The site approval process, it requires a wide variety of stakeholders. So there are different people depending on the site who have a stake in the approval process. But one that is consistent is the Ybor City Barrio, which is a city entity. The barrio exists for a few reasons. One is that it maintains that anything that happens within the community has to align with historic preservation standards. The community is technically a part of the National Historic Register, and making sure that I'm working with them is important. There are projects that go up within the community that do not go before the barrio. They can face fines, but also thinking about the importance of working ethically and within the different boundaries of what those things are, working with the city rather than working against them is something that I've worked to do. And finally, thinking about this, the project, as I said, was initiated in 2020, but the first site was revealed in 2023. The first site is that of the 1937 Anti-Fascist Women's March. This seemed like an apt location in 2020, so, it ended up being more prescient than I would have assumed all these years later. But the first site was the 1937 Anti-Fascist Women's March. The history of anti-fascism plays a role in my book within its second chapter, but it's also a history that had been documented during different periods in Ybor City's past. There is another historian, Ana Varela Lago, who during her period as a master's student at the University of South Florida did a fantastic oral history project and also collected tons of materials connected to the anti-fascist organizing within the community that haven't been digitized. So that is what I have been focusing on during the USLDH period, is digitizing those elements in order to translate it to a digital project. But this site, it brought together a few things. The leaders who are involved in the Anti-Fascist Women's March in Florida, they bring together an international, a national, and a local component. They are inspired and they are directly in contact with leaders of the anti-fascist movement during the Spanish Civil War who are located in Spain. They're also actively involved in people who have a sense of understanding and also redefining of their own activism. They are national labor leaders who we don't readily associate with the US South or with Florida namely people such as Luisa Moreno. And finally, it was a movement of massive resistance within Florida. In this one day, in this one march, there were over 7,000 women who marched in protest. And on a very different and personal level, also thinking of why we're driven to do these things and thinking about ourselves and our community, is that it was this march that was my entree into the book, into thinking of Ybor City as more than a place of where my family was from, but of the political background and the political trajectories that we all inherit. I learned about the 1937 Anti-Fascist Women's March from my grandmother, who saw a clipping of that moment in the Tampa Bay Times in the early 1990s, and she placed it in this white binder where she put everything that reminded her of her community. My family is came to the United States to live and work in Ybor City, and they worked in the cigar industry. The first member of my family came in the early 1900s, and the last came in the 1930s. But to me, Ybor City, even being from there, it was not anything that was special. It was a place where we went to celebrate. It was where my grandma thought I should buy my earrings because if I got them from the Cuban jeweler, I wouldn't lose them. It's not true. I lost everything. But like it didn't feel, we don't think of things as historical if we're always around them until so many years later, and those stories seem small. But it was in the early 2000s, just before my grandmother died in 2002. I was a teenager, where she pulled this clipping out of her binder, and she wanted to show me the women in her family who were a part of this. And she pulled it out and she identified Abuela Amelia, her grandmother, who I never met, and my Aunt Mago, who I did know growing up, and their role being a part of this. And the way she presented it at the time was that, they did something that put them in the newspaper. That was my only memory. It took me all those years to figure out why it mattered. So thinking about that connection between myself and between family also became a way to connect with community, and thinking about why these stories are so important and what we lose, especially in the process of redefining who inherits Latinidad, who controls it, and what that means. So I began working with the city, and we came to a decision on an artist after a submission process. And this was the design that became the mural in the background. Students in my Latinx history Latinx history class at Texas A&M assisted in the design and the redesign of what they believed the mural should look like. So there were several designs. And it was one student, when it came to this artist, who really stood out to me. And the way that he described it was that to their group, or to him specifically, as he said, that the mural, it wasn't a group of women who looked the way that we want women to look, but it reminded him to remember history as it was rather than as we wish it to be. That the women in the images, that they look like they have different ages. He says some look like they are working. He's like, there's actually an image in the background of what this is. And from the perspective of the artist, she has different imagery that's connected. So the red flowers are in relationship to, over here, Dolores Ibarruri, who is at the top, one of the Spanish organizers and leaders of the anti-fascist movement, who coined the phrase "no pasarán" during the 1930s. Luisa Moreno, who is in the center, became the first woman to lead the Cigar Makers International Union and organized women in Ybor City during the 1930s as they became the primary manufacturers. And then she wanted to put a face of one of the many women who then led the process, who led the local movement. And she did an image of my Aunt Mago from the original photograph, who is now on the wall. The picture in the background is an image from a protest locally. So she brings together these different elements. The design had to align with the limitations of the city, and by the barrio, they wanted something that looked like it could naturally exist within the community. So a bit like an advertisement. And this is what it looks like as you are walking through. All right, so as you're walking down the street on the side of a building. The historical marker is adjacent, and on the other side is the original historical photo. And then to the right is the mural. It took about 7 days for it to go up. And in the process of it going up, we documented the artist. She's a Cuban American artist who lives in Ybor City. We documented her work and shared it progressively on Twitter and Instagram. And the project became one that had international attention, reaching from Spain to different areas in Puerto Rico and to the United States as well. So the main question of this, and while it was very successful on a community-based level, and there was tons of community programming in order to raise awareness for what the project sought to do, and also for that individual event, one of the things was making sure to share it with a broader audience and also maintain that there is a way to portray accurate information. One of the negatives that I found from doing the public history project is I cannot be in Ybor City to do historical programming 52 weeks in a year. And when you are not there defining a narrative, there are many different journalists who will define it for you. So having a digital space in order to do this, to create both a space to learn as well as to share, is the goal of the project. The other thing is that I see this as a two-part pilot where the digital project will it will prepare for the next site and also help with additional funding. I've already submitted to additional grants through both the NEH and also smaller endeavors in order to support this. The website is going to have both film available, audio available, a timeline, both an outline of the history of the event, and art is going to play a role. I'm working with an illustrator who is also going to create cartoon movement and connecting and blending both the historical documents and the storyline. So the timeline for this that we are working with right now, Milton was a fun pause in the midst of all of this. I would have had a full website for you guys by now had Milton not happened, but that's okay. So we are my plan was to market test this fall and to launch in the spring, but I'm going to market test in the spring and unveil the final website in the summer or the fall. So with that, right now, we have completed all the digitization of everything that's going to go on there. I've created lesson plans for K through 12. And we are finalizing the process of these small videos with the cartoonist and also with the and the videographer in order to create space. The idea of artwork being at the forefront is what is there, and I've been playing with a web designer on what this will look like as well. So the goal is to finish this. The next site of the Nuestra Historias project is already approved and the historical marker is made, but we're holding it until the website is up so that we can begin to think about how it will work in landscape and how we can have the project as a complete package together. And thank you all very much.
What a wonderful project, Sarah. This is so powerful and amazing, and it's a beautiful way to see how, you know, the digital humanities it allows us to work in such an interdisciplinary way, right? And to think through about how we can empower and leverage some of the work that has been happening, you know, at different levels. So amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the support. I couldn't do it without you guys.
Well, thank you. You're welcome. We are trying to you know, through the success of these projects, we hope that we can continue to request for funding. I mean, it's, you know, not only us but other entities that can continue to see the value and the grants in aid, and you know, as your projects continue to receive more funding, they're able to see, institutions, foundations are able to see that there is a need to continue to support this work. So now we're moving on to Christofer Rodelo. He's with the University of California, Irvine. And I won't say the title of your presentation so you all can say it yourselves in case it has changed. All right, so take it away, Christofer.
Great. Thank you. Can everyone see my slides? Okay, awesome. So thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here present some thoughts on what I was able to do with the grant and aid. My name is Christofer Rodelo, and I'm an assistant professor of Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California at Irvine. So my talk is entitled Reconstructing Latinx Performance History: It's a Digital Approach. So broadly speaking, as a scholar of Latinx performance history, I blend traditional archival research with methods from performance studies to understand how Latinx identity formation in the United States has been influenced by historical displays of racialized bodies in theater and everyday life. My current book project, Spectacles of Relation, Race, Performance, and the Latinx 19th Century, unearths this history through a focus on 6 different performers, from cross-dressing Confederate soldiers to sideshow acts, whose racialization in their time period, and this is roughly between 1848 and 1898, I argue, paved the way for thinking of Latinx as a category of ethno-racial difference. So in embarking on this, my book project, I've had to engage in an array of archival research to reconstruct and imagine the lives of the performers I study. And this certainly was not an easy task. It involved going to lots of different archives, being very sort of like uncomfortable and trying to figure out how to do archival work, for those of you who are maybe familiar with it, especially doing sort of Latinx historical work. It can be a sort of a complicated process. In doing this work, I knew that not all the material I was encountering would make it into my book manuscript. That's just sort of an impossibility. I also realized that a lot of this material was not necessarily the most accessible. It involved going to lots of different archives and having to be creative with how I search for things. Certainly terms like Latinx or Latine were not in use in the lifetimes of the case studies of my project, and as a result, not necessarily searchable in card catalogs or databases. And also, while some of the material might have been digitized, more often than not, it wasn't, making it all the more difficult to find. So, inspired by scholars working in Latinx digital humanities work, including folks in this virtual room, and with the support of this grant, I have begun my own PH project entitled Latinx Performance Histories, which uses publishing platforms like Omeka to make archival documents about Latinx performers and artists from the 19th century available to use in an easily accessible online repository. It also uses these archival sources, which can include newspapers, photographs, and other forms of ephemera, to create maps and other visualizations about a given performer's life and travels. The goal of this project is to make more visible these often forgotten histories and to inspire further research and artistic endeavors on the figures of the Latinx past. So in this talk, this really brief talk, I will just share a bit of what I've been doing over the past months working on this project, including the approach, case studies, and future plans. This is very much an in-progress project, and I welcome feedback and questions as I sort of continue to develop the aims of my endeavors. So as I mentioned before, my experiences in the archive motivated me to consider what other possibilities might exist for presenting and curating the archival material I'd encountered, not just for me, but importantly to inspire other scholars, artists, and the general public who might be interested about Latinx aesthetic cultures of the past. So in winter and spring of 2024, I began surveying existing DH projects that focus on Latinx studies and adjacent fields. I also began to consult with faculty and staff associated with digital humanities at my home institution to describe my research questions and see what digital platforms and tools might be the most useful for my project. And I think this is an important moment here where I really had to sort of decenter my own authority as like the professor, right? I think it was a lot of like humbling conversation and like generative conversations with people at my institution, and other collaborators. Like I had this idea, how I best approach this, and I really, I think it was a really important moment for me and sort of my intellectual development and thinking about the publicness of this work and the importance of collaboration and how collaboration can be really important for humanistic scholarship when that tends to not be the norm when we're very much focused on like sole publications and things like that. But in this sort of like searching process, I knew that I wanted to sort of create something that could be accessible, accessible repository for these archival sources, as well as a site from which I could curate exhibits and other visualizations to tell different kinds of stories about the performers beyond just my published writing. I also knew that as a very much a newcomer to the world of DH, who was doing this project alongside my book and other publication endeavors, I wanted to sort of use a platform with relatively low barriers to entry, something that didn't involve a lot of coding, that kind of stuff. So in summer of 2024, the Latinx Performance Histories projects began development in earnest. So as a new project, I decided to focus on one set of performers in its initial stage of development, the Salvadorian freak show performers Maxim Bartola, who you see pictured here. For those who are not familiar, Maxim Bartola were a set of indigenous performers from El Salvador who toured the United States and Europe during the second half of the 19th century as sensationalized, quote-unquote, Aztec children, a performance identity that was sort of built on their status as indigenous migrants from El Salvador and their physical and behavioral disabilities. So including them in Latinx Performance Histories as sort of the inaugural case study, I sought to make the records of their performances, seen as newspapers, photographs, and other forms of ephemera, available to broader audiences. It was sort of the hope that starting off with one case study that maybe was not as well known in Latinx studies per se would demonstrate that my project is in alignment with current efforts in the field to expand its horizons, to consider the experiences of Black and Indigenous Latinx subjects as part of its rubric of Latinidad, and to kind of add a historical element to this sort of reckoning within the field. In other words, in making them the focus of this Latinx Performance Histories project, I sought to add to a vision of Latinx studies that thought alternatively about its genealogies and what possibilities might exist in recounting their stories through digital means. So with the support of this grant, I was able to hire a graduate student researcher at my home institution to support the initial development of the stage of the Latinx Performance Project. So based on talking with DH staff at my institution, I decided to build the project on Omeka Classic, a web publishing platform for sharing digital collection that also allowed me to create online exhibits. This was presented to me as sort of an easy way to sort of get started at this current stage of development. And we envisioned this project as sort of two parts. One that would sort of catalog and display over the 200 archival items I had collected as part of my research on Maxim Bartola, and the other to use these archival materials to construct public-facing exhibits about their lives. So I think this is the two-part thing, like kind of a research kind of component and then sort of a public-facing thing. But I think the ultimate goal is really to create more awareness about these performers and who they are. So it's not just, me doing it or other people, but really to create more of expansive awareness. So for the first part, I work with my graduate student researcher to sort of include each archival item into the Omeka site. This involved creating a taxonomy for the metadata for the site that aligned with the existing Dublin core sort of system in place in Omeka. Because the sources were so varied, it was really important for us to have sort of a common lexicon to describe them within the database. So in other words, like we knew that, as this project is going to develop, there'll be different kinds of performances, different kinds of like theater makers that we want to include. So it was important to have like a really clear sense of like the sort of like tagging that we're going to be using in this project. So that was really important for us to sort of have those conversations. We also, like, in creating these sort of these entries, also included tags that would allow others who are searching the database to find sources that were grouped together under similar categories, such as geographic location or venue. And you can see sort of an example of this right here. This is an entry print for an advertisement from one of Maxim Bartola's later performances in London. And we have made various metadata categories such as title, subject, and description that also have tags that will be searchable for users of the site. So when reflecting on putting together this part of the project, I really had to think creatively about what it meant to make these sources available for a wide array of scholars, artists, and the public. This meant, of course, getting permissions and talking with the curators and librarians where these sources came from. It meant you sort of using consistent metadata categories that could be applied to other case studies in future iterations. It meant that each file that we added had the OCR capabilities to allow for more accessible engagement with the materials. And also something we're still in the progress of is like ways of making things available both in English and Spanish, and really just thinking capaciously about how these sort of things might be accessible. I also would admit that this took a lot more time than I had anticipated. I think that, I think for me, my GSR were like, okay, like we have these materials, we're going to put it in, but it really took a lot of time. And so I think it was a good learning lesson for myself about setting realistic goals when like starting a DH project that kind of fits our capacity and our skill set. And this is sort of an ongoing thing that we're doing here. But I think we wanted our best to sort of like replicate, in other words, the experience of what it might mean to go into the archives without actually having to go there yourselves, and make sure that we're providing information that was relevant for scholars who were sort of or artists and people who are interested in these histories. And there's also this question of like working with what the archives might allow and expanding that through the digital was also at the heart, the second part of the project, which is to create online exhibits that would use the archival items in the collection and sort of media-rich modes of storytelling about each performer. So here I thought about what would be useful to highlight that would be relevant across a variety of performers to include at the project in later stages. So the first exhibit we created focused on sort of highlighting the different locations that Maxim Bartola performed in over the course of their decades-long career, given that they performed in various locations across the US and Europe. So this is like we took sort of advantage of the fact that these performers like really were engaging transatlantically in the 19th century. That felt that was a really interesting story to tell and that we could use. In this instance, we used the resource Story Maps GS from Northwestern University's Knight Lab, sort of an open source tool for media content creation. And this allowed us to kind of create a narrative arc that could move from place to place, allowing the viewer to imagine in new ways sort of the broader scope of the performance circuit. Other exhibits that are sort of still in the works for us include one highlighting one I'm really excited about. So for Max and Bartolo, there are lots of like popular culture that kind of existed and permeated around them, including like musical scores. Like there's this Aztec polka that's really interesting. We've been playing, and I've been talking to folks at my institution about using kind of like AI technologies to like recreate the songs and things like so. So I think there's a lot of like potential here, right, to engage with not just the materials themselves, but ways to sort of use emerging technologies to sort of really imagine and expand and get at what we can't ultimately get at is like the live performance, right? We can never really see this live performance. There's no like recording of it. Those technologies didn't exist in the mid-19th century, but we can approximate using existing archival sources. And what I'm realizing is with digital tools that we have to be really creative about how we can like sort of imagine the experiences of sort of being on the stage, being in the audience, their experiences, most importantly, as performers, like how can we get at the question of their, of their choices, of their experiences. And I think that the digital tools are showing to me that might be more possible than we might have thought before. So as I mentioned, this project very much is still in phase one, which means we're sort of building out a prototype that'll hopefully be a model for other performers in the project. Other plans for Latinx performance histories includes creating teaching guides for K-12 educators, providing opportunities for artists and theater makers interested in historical Latinx narratives to use the archival materials for their creative endeavors. And it's something I'm actually working on right now with the Chicano playwright. We're working on a kind of clear fabulation of the story of Joaquin Murrieta from the Gold Rush era, and we're very much thinking about using archival materials and kind of playing with them through the realm of like creative work, but very much like I think we're working on like getting funding to kind of create an artist residency and stuff like that, but like very much based in like archival material. And also I've been sort of talking with my colleagues at Irvine who are working in virtual reality and game studies to think about ways of sort of creating simulations of historical performances. Certainly such developments I've recognized are a function of how much time and resources one can commit to them. Especially, I see that as like a junior scholar, or I have certain expectations upon me about what to do in order to receive tenure. And it's something I'm still kind of thinking about a lot in terms of like, and I think maybe we're all thinking about this, so the ways of making this work, quote unquote, count for our various institutions. And certainly this also reflects the hierarchy of where work such as this may sit. Public work about Latinxes, about performance of the arts, and how they sort of sit amongst funding structures and research priorities. But it is my hope that this project, that me and with my collaborators, we can continue to sort of do this work and really employ marry historical research and creative sort of endeavors to create truly interdisciplinary scholarship. And this is sort of my hope and my desire as I continue to develop this project. So I think I'll stop there, but I wanted to give my thanks again for this grant that really kind of kickstarted this thing. And I look forward to a further conversation amongst everyone here. So thank you.
That is so cool, Christofer. Thank you so much. I love everything that like this little Pandora box that you just opened with all the different and multitude of possibilities that are now coming out of this one concept that you had, right? For this project that started out as a one thing, right? And now there's so many possibilities and so many ways to connect across your own campus, right? For other possibilities. That's the beauty of this thing that we've uncovered, and that's how, for Carolina and myself, it started out with thinking about how we extend the work that Recovery and Arte Público has been doing for like 38 years at that time. And then now it's like, there's a whole new section of recovery scholars all over the nation that will carry on, hopefully, right, will usher on the work that was started with our scholars in the early 70s, and and even before that, with the people whose work we've been recovering through the recovery program. It's just so empowering. So our last presenter today is Ana Nogar, and she's with the University of New Mexico. And so we'll let you take it away, Ana.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I want to thank everyone at Recovery for this wonderful opportunity to work in digital humanities, which is a new area for me. I'm at the beginning of this book project that I've been kind of collecting primary data about for a little while now. And the digital humanities opportunity to like both pull materials together that I have started to collect and put them in some sort of shape. And with the help and support of all the folks at Recovery, Gaby, Carolina, Lorena, you're always wonderful, amazing, thoughtful, next step, next level advice in thinking about these projects was very, very helpful. And I look forward to continue working on this project. I want to present first a little bit the shape of the figure who I'm working on right now, and then move to the digital humanities piece of it, which is an online timeline, which has been very helpful clarifying certain parts of the biography of this individual and also making them more accessible. There are also certain aspects of the folklore material that this individual collected, which are probably best viewed or participated in a way that isn't on the printed page. Okay, so the individual who I'm interested in creating what I'm describing as a biobibliography is 19th century Nuevo Mexicana folklorist Aurora Lucero-White Lee. Aurora Lucero was born near Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1894 and died in Santa Fe in 1963. And she's this fascinating figure to me who spans and represents an entire generation of Nuevo Mexicano treaty citizens. Because, of course, in 1894, when she was born, New Mexico was still a territory. It was not a state of the United States. Her father and others were very active in documenting the political comings and goings of New Mexico in the Spanish language newspapers of the time. And later, many of them became key figures in political positions within the territorial government and then later the state government. So Aurora had a front row seat to many of the political discourses, conversations, activities that were occurring in the territory and later state of New Mexico both within her family and then as part of other conversations. You'll note in the title here, the second part of my interest in her has to do with Pan-Americanism and her involvement in the concept of Pan-Americanism, specifically how New Mexico could be a Pan-American point of articulation. Its Spanish-speaking population could be fully enfranchised within the United States as the connecting link between the US and the rest of Latin America, and her particular activism in that as an individual, and later in her literary, really pedagogical production. When she's discussed, which is rare, she's primarily discussed in the context of her folkloric studies. And this is the one that's the best known. This is one of the editions, Literary Folklore of the Hispanic Southwest. But in the course of looking at the primary materials about her, newspaper articles that we found in Chronicling America, and some of the other databases that exist of early 19th century, 20th century newspapers in the US, the story is so much more rich than just that. I will note, however, that this is where my interest comes from because she's so little cited in a context where scholars of ethnopoetics, folklorists of color were largely male. And she doesn't appear in the list of folklorists, like in the context, say, of somebody like Aurelio Espinosa, Campa, Arturo Campa, or even Americo Paredes. When she's compared to him, it's in the sense that she didn't collect enough corridos, or what she collected was not somehow authentic to the community that she represented. And I think it's important to create a broader vision of her in her historical moment. And for that, the timeline was extremely, extremely helpful. Okay. Sorry. Oops, sorry. Through the initial research of looking at newspaper articles, looking at the Center for Southwest Research here in New Mexico, some other online repositories of materials, we were able to start collecting a really interesting and rich selection, as all people who do historical research find out, of images, news pieces, mentions. This is a bit of a gloss of her that was published in the newspaper in the 1940s, maybe a little bit later than that. Describes her teaching career. It describes her involvement in Pan-Americanism. We'll talk about that in just a moment. It also describes some of the things that she was known for having published, which included a script for the Pastorela, El Coloquio de los Pastores, which was subsequently used, performed, and cited, often without crediting her for the work that went into its collection and documentation and publication. In the heritage language program that we have here at the University of New Mexico, we frequently cite, without really having a whole lot of historical context for what this speech was about, a speech called Defensa de nuestro idioma, which was as you see here on the newspaper article that's in the background, it says strong plea for the Spanish. What it's referring to is a plea for the continued teaching of Spanish in public schools in New Mexico with the same intensity as English, as New Mexico, as you can see here, it's February 1911, is on the brink of statehood. And when eliminating Spanish from public discourse, including teaching in its public schools, was held out as a condition for statehood. So she enters an oratorical contest, one that she enters a couple of times, with a speech that argues for the vitality, how important it is to continue teaching Spanish in public schools as New Mexico is about to become a state, and not to sacrifice that possibility to become a state. So anyway, she's primarily known for this, but this is part of a larger story about her participation as a young orator in these public spaces, in public bilingual spaces, how it's reflected in the Spanish language news periodicals, how it's reflected in English language periodicals, and who she is as a public figure at this time and later. As we continued to research, we discovered that in addition to her cousin, Nina Otero Warren, the first Latina to run for Congress in the US, Aurora Lucero was a strong advocate for women's suffrage in New Mexico, showing up on the doorstep of the one-time US Senator Thomas B. Catron to argue for women's rights to vote, not just right to vote, but other rights of women. This is something that I hadn't really seen until we fished out of the newspaper articles. She's giving speeches in front of the State House in Santa Fe. She's giving speeches in front of the senator. The senator was very opposed to women's right to vote, as well as many other fundamental forms of enfranchisement for women. But she was out on the steps with 150 other women who drove their cars up to his house to ask for greater rights for women. New Mexico, of course, would later vote in favor of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, in part on behalf of the Spanish language advocacy, because she gives her speech in Spanish, of women like Aurora Lucero and, Tara Warren. All to set the stage for like a multifaceted individual who's doing a lot of different things over the course of their life. At Highlands University, which is where she received her master's degree for doing field work in folklore, where she does some of her early work on corridos and the pastorela. She also later becomes a faculty member at New Mexico Normal University, which is now New Mexico Highlands University. It had been the Teachers College, and now it's a college, a university. I see we have a couple Highlands people here in the audience. I like to include this because so much is happening at the time when she becomes a faculty member there. She leaves, she comes back, she works with her students in the field collecting folklore. So she's one of these early people who combines pedagogy with the sense of urgency of collecting primary information, primary folklore from the communities who are still practicing it. Looking a little bit forward, this we haven't included in the timeline, but this is an image of Aurora working in the offices of the Works Projects Administration. The image is from the New Mexico History Museum. Interestingly, she collected a large body of folklore, which is now part of the WPA collection, the originals of which live in Santa Fe and copies of which we have here at the Center for Southwest Research. But very little of what she collected appeared in the final publication of the WPA. So the WPA would produce these publications, these books that were supposed to represent the folk culture of the places where these practices were documented all across the country. And her materials were not included in that book in a significant manner. So people typically consult the archive for the WPA rather than that book for that reason. But I wanted to show this picture, which is very clearly staged. Everyone's sitting around, smoking in the archives, doing the things that they did back in the day. And she's kind of posed there right in the middle. I kind of wonder, and I'm interested, things we'd never do. I kind of wonder how this experience, and I'm looking for more substantiation of this idea, how this experience propelled the later publication of her own works to make sure that the materials that she collected made it into print and that they were available to a greater number of people, as she puts in the introduction to one of her books, as we'll see on the timeline, which is, these materials are frequently only available to folklore scholars. I want them to be available to the general public. This text, Folk Dances of the Spanish Colonials of New Mexico, came out in 2 editions in 1937 and in 1940. I featured this publication of her several small book publications because I think this would be the next step on the pathway forward for Digital Humanities Project for this subject. The dances are remarkably complex. So many other folklorists would record the lyrics to songs, maybe write down the partitura, right, the music that accompanies the songs, but almost nobody documented the actual steps to these dances. And these are the dances that occurred at events that were often derisively referred to as fandangos or community dances. I worked with an undergraduate student a few semesters ago thinking about these folk dances, who is a choreographer in her free time, and asked if maybe she could think about performing or finding a couple students to perform some of these dances with her. And she started to work on this and said, these dances are extremely complicated. You have to have a number of internalized rules that you need to know to be able to carry them out in community. You have to know by the song that this is a dance that occurs in groups of 4. This one occurs in groups of 8. This one occurs in lines. So we have what seems to be here like a simple short book, but which encapsulates a type of lived culture that is much more complicated than it might at first seem. So I think this text in particular would lend itself well to a more fully fleshed view of what these dances are and what they meant for community. Coloquio de los Pastores. We'll talk a little bit about this later. We'll find a citation of people performing in Española Public High School, a version of her Coloquio de los Pastores. If you've ever seen the PBS version of La Pastorela, you know, there's all these versions of the Pastorela that take place in different contexts. Her version is really, really interesting and very little cited, but here's the script, which she published herself, of course. There's still more archival work to do. Here are some of the places we have in mind. We discovered through the course of the recent research that her daughter, Dolores Caskey-White, who was a bilingual advocate in Pennsylvania, shared some of her mother's material with some of these places, specifically with the New Mexico Historical Society, and their material still with the Tucumcari Public School District, which is another place where she worked, that would like to go explore. So this is to offer an entire sort of overview of who she is, a multifaceted personality. And now I would like to share with you, I'd like to share with you the timeline that we've created so far to get an idea of where we are on this project. Let's see if I can share the right thing now. Let's see, how about this? Can you see my timeline? Okay, alrighty. So the timeline was incredibly helpful. I tend to be somebody who works on historical projects in a way that I would describe as loosely organized piles of stuff. So putting things into a timeline and creating a chronology was amazing. It was amazingly helpful, and it was amazing to see where we were understanding things as unique events, or news items we had seen as unique events, where there were repetitions, where they were quoting each other, where they were revising each other, and get some clarity on the progress of events, the progress of translations of speeches that she gave, and to get a sense for where she was in her life when different things were happening. So we'll see here shortly. This first slide is just an introduction, telling a little bit about her complexity, her multifaceted nature. I describe here a few of the things. She's the oldest of 7 children. Her father, Antonio Lucero, would become the first Secretary of State of New Mexico in 1912. So she sort of had a front row seat, as I mentioned before, but really once her father becomes Secretary of State, to everything that's happening in New Mexico as it becomes a state, the policies that are in play, the questions about bilingual education, the questions about employment regarding Spanish-speaking and native-speaking peoples within the government. And so she's there, and she hears all this, and it informs who she is. We see this early career. She starts helps form an oratorical society. We see here that she's going to recite Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, King Robert of Sicily. So this is some reporting that occurs in one of the English language newspapers in Las Vegas. Her father, of course, is the owner-editor of one of the Spanish language newspapers in Las Vegas, New Mexico, Las Vegas being a point of confluence and often conflict between Anglo and Hispano communities in New Mexico, because it's where the railroad ends in New Mexico in the 19th century, from about 1870s on. This is really interesting to me. It's interesting to see who she has chosen to recite. I've recently published a book on Felipe Chacon, a rough contemporary of Aurora Lucero, and he includes in his collection of poetry translations to Spanish of poetry by certain English language poets. Longfellow is one of them. So clearly there's like a sort of a repertoire of English language poets that are circulating among Spanish speakers in New Mexico, and who kind of draw literary attention. Because of, well, for many reasons, there are a number of society entries in the paper. We didn't include all of them in the timeline, but I wanted to note that there are a number of articles, such as the one that you are seeing now. Lucero serves as a bridesmaid in her friend Margarita Silva's wedding. The Las Vegas West Side Catholic Church was a Hispanic Catholic church in Las Vegas. So there's a lot of encoded information as well in this simple society entry. There are dozens of these, just so we don't have to hear about all. I mean, in the future project, there will be all the information about the the picnics and the parties and the gatherings and so forth. But here we're using this as a placeholder to describe other types of society activities and the interest in her as a public figure, even as a young woman. Okay, here's one of the places where the timeline helped us get some clarity on a couple of different oratorical contests that happened and her participation in the public sphere as an orator. As many of you know, in the 19th century, early 20th century, being an orator, somebody who would give a public speech, who would read poetry for a public audience, was an important social role, right? This was an important thing to be able to do. She's kind of staking her claim or making herself known in this space. We see here that she gets, I think she wins third place in the college division with Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Schools of New Mexico? She was the only Nuevo Mexicana, only Hispana to compete in this competition, the oratorical competition. And then we later see she's complimented by the Spanish ambassador for this speech, which of course advocates for the continued teaching of Spanish in the public schools. Also, the International Bureau of Pan-American Union congratulates her. So we see that she has a visibility on the basis of her advocacy for the teaching of Spanish in public schools in what would become the state of New Mexico. We see the publication of the original, which was English, into Spanish as Defensa de Nuestro Idioma. So on one hand, we have Shall the Spanish Language Be Taught in the Public Schools of New Mexico? And then in Spanish, Defensa de Nuestro Idioma. So there's a different sort of posture in the titling of these two things, but we are noting that there's a timeline here, the publication first of English and then in the Spanish language newspapers. Her graduation. The next year she participates again in the oratorical contest. Again, she's the only woman and the only Hispano-Americana to participate in the contest. And we have this interesting and intriguing little note that said, had it not been for a disturbance in the hallway, she would have won first place. We're not sure what that disturbance is, if it has something to do of the basis of her speech, which was called New Occasions Teach New Duties. And it advocates for the educational needs of the Spanish-speaking population in this context of New Mexico's approaching statehood. So we're not exactly sure I'm not exactly sure actually what the connection is between the content of that speech and the fuss that happened in the hall and her placing in this contest, but it shows her in this continued public-facing role. Fue aclamada con frenético entusiasmo, the Spanish language version of the events of that oratorical contest. Moving forward, we have this debate that she participates in at New Mexico Normal University as a student advocating for women's rights. Seems like it presages her later protesting on the doorstep of Thomas B. Catron. She is later appointed to the board of managers for the Panama, California exhibition. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this was part of a exhibition that was the Panama, California exhibition. There were two sites, one in San Francisco, one in San Diego. She was part of the women's auxiliary who was setting out a curriculum to be shared at the exhibition. This building, which still exists in Balboa Park, was based off of the church in Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico. And she was sort of is another early entree into her role in Pan-Americanism, the view of Latinos in the borderlands as part of the Pan-American connection between the US and the rest of the hemisphere. Anyway, sort of an interesting, there's more to be said here. We're not ready to say it. Here she is arguing for women's suffrage. Here she is appointing to the Second Pan-American Scientific Congress as a ladies delegation aide. What that means is she was a translator for all of these events that were held by the secretary through the Department of State, connecting Latin American leaders with political leaders in the US. So she traveled with the Scientific Congress and was a translator interpreter for many of these interchanges.
Anna,
sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I know we have to finish by 2:30, so I want to give, but if you want to add some concluding remarks so that we can continue to any questions that our audience might have.
Sure. I wanted to add, because I won't talk too much more about some of these other events. But she was at the christening of the battleship. Well, she was supposed to be the christening of the battleship New Mexico. Super fascinating. Here we have this portrait of her that was shown at the Palace of Governors that was done by an Ohio-based person who came to New Mexico. And she's described, just in case somebody out there has ever seen this portrait and you would like to help us find this portrait, the portrait is of Aurora, of a Spanish beauty wrapped snugly in a finely embroidered Spanish shawl, which is draped over one shoulder so as to leave the right shoulder and both arms bare. She reclines on a couch over which is thrown a flag in Mexican colors, making a bright background of red, white, and green. The entire canvas producing a striking effect. I bet it was striking. If any of you have heard or seen of this picture, please reach out. I just want to take you very quickly to the end here. A lot of these are sort of creating that biobibliography, showing what her publication record, explaining a little bit the trajectory of these publications. And then the last bit is a film that she actually appears in shortly before her death called Santa Fe and the Trail, produced by the Encyclopedia Britannica. It is definitely a film of its time. And she appears in the dance scene of that film. So anyway, this is an ongoing project. Thank you very much for the opportunity to explore it in this manner. And I would love to stop talking. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you all so much for your amazing and powerful work. I mean, as you can see, like Anna's work starts as a book manuscript, and so now it has grown so many legs and wheels, and it's a whole new project that is developing so many other opportunities to deliver the work that this amazing writer was doing in New Mexico. So we have the floor open for some questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question, or like I said, you can also write it into the chat and we'll read it. Let me go ahead and start with one question that is almost always present in a lot of these presentations that we've done in the past is it has to do with like ethical concerns related to the archival materials that you're working from, and so you take into consideration how we're bringing in these archival materials into other spaces, physical, virtual spaces that we didn't imagine before, and so. Thinking through that, are there any ethical concerns that you all have to be considering as you are preparing the public-facing aspect of your DH project? And I know that I can maybe point out, maybe thinking about like in the case of Sarah's, when she mentioned, in her work, she's thinking she wants to make sure that the communities are represented in the way in which they expect it to be represented. So what happens when that doesn't happen, right? Who steps in to do that? In the case of Christofer, when we bring into these public spaces this imagery of a specific community and the way they were represented, are we reifying certain stereotypes, or how are we making sure that they're presented within a context, right? And then in Anna's case, we are also taking, materials that have been presented in a variety of aspects, right? The figure of Aurora is extremely, crucial to the New Mexico community. And a lot of times that we decontextualize her from that space, or we need to understand where she's coming from as well. And a lot of times it's easy to not use that background, right? Because we want to. So
well, I would say when thinking about that contextual piece, which is so important, Gabi, like rather than putting up all the possible newspaper articles that we could find on the timeline, we chose instead to carefully develop a few moments in a way that allowed us to provide a fuller context for those moments, rather than rather than creating just an infinitely detailed or infinitely, I don't know, a number of pins on a map without explaining their relationship to the overall picture. And that became very important as we started looking at all the possibilities of things that we could put on this timeline. What sort of story, what parts of the story did we want to delve into? We felt more comfortable putting less explanation for the time being and talking about the bibliographic elements because those exist in the public sphere. And we were talking mostly about their existence in the world rather than the close critical examination just yet. But that is so important in understanding, especially these historical figures, what is the context in which they're emerging and why are they having the conversations that they're having?
Yes, Kenya.
Yeah, I have a question for Sarah, or I guess because in a way I share some concerns with her with regard to, you know, who gets to tell the story of Ybor City or West Tampa and what story gets told. So I'm just wondering, I mean, it's fascinating that you have a connection to the space in a way that, you know, I can't ever have, right? Because of your family roots there. But just wondering what two things. One, what do you think can be done to address the erasure of Blackness in Ybor City, in the history of Ybor City, both Black Cuban and Black American history and contributions, and it's tied to this, you know, you're seeing the enormous development that's going on there now. There's all these incredibly expensive apartments and offices and so on and so forth that, I mean, just recently there was the inauguration of the so-called Martí building by Quintela, who is, you know, as far as I'm concerned, is only interested in the money and not really interested in the history at all. So I just wonder, you know, whether you feel like you face a challenge with regard to telling parts of the story that a lot of the residents, or, you know, the descendants of the residents, aren't really interested in sharing or having shared.
No, absolutely. So if I take the first site, for example, to Kenya's point, when I was writing the book, one of my biggest fears was my grandfather. My book opens talking about his dad being a Communist Party organizer and his statement that we will never talk about this beyond this moment. My reaction to sharing the work and doing community programs in a way that they are not academic programs. The way that I talk to community is incredibly different than the way I speak on this platform, and the way that I speak in an undergrad classroom, or the way that I speak at an academic conference. Because if I do, it will immediately turn people off. But if I begin in a way that invites people into a story, they begin telling stories where they recognize exactly what happened. And if there's anything that I took away from talking about anti-fascism and the reaction to that project, I mean, for context, the portion of bringing it online is that every community event that I did had an attendance of a minimum of 150 people consistently over the course of 2 months. That was not what I expected at all. I mean, like, I was showing up to things with like a mobile microphone that I was not prepared to need to address that many people. With the changing of what's going on in Ybor City and what Kenya is referencing, there is one developer who at this point, I believe, roughly owns 60% of the buildings within the historic district. Anything that has become available, he has purchased. There are two different issues that are involved in that, aside from that point that I just mentioned of one person owning 60% of buildings, is that the process of that, he and those who he works with, right, have endeared, right? There is this portion where buildings that have been redone in memory of what was once there. So there are historic names. There are historians who are from the Tampa Bay History Center who are writing the plaques that are going on things. And they might not be how you and I would write them, but they're not inaccurate. I've gone down there to read them. So it makes it difficult. The other thing is when you walk through Ybor, at least I was last home a few months ago, is that it's increasingly and rapidly becoming something I don't recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And while there is this attention to what it means aesthetically and physically, there's also a lack of attention to investing in the history as it was. It is, in a way, it reminds me of urban renewal, but in many fashions. In urban renewal, and I didn't talk about this, guys, but at one point, Ybor City's like, let's build like a, what is it called? What was it called with the bulls? A
Oh
bullfighting,
God, yes, yes.
and to put like like a wall around the city. We can reflect on walls in many ways at this point, but it's for other people right now. What Ybor City is being made is for other people, not for the community. Those who are descendants, when I did this programming, that was the thing that I learned, was how eager people were to talk about what it was and what it meant to them. While there has all been generationally all this hesitance to talk about those things, I think right now they're very eager. But the other reason I want to do it and why I did it the way I did is that I wanted somebody to talk about Ybor who wasn't, not that there's a problem with that, but 65 plus, because that's all who comes to programs generally. And what did it mean to invite younger people, and especially activists and those who can halt changes to community into it? And that was what it did. The majority of those who came and the relationships that I built between media and other people who reached out with especially social media, there are young Latina influencers who became very
Mm-hmm.
involved, and those with different labor unions, of talking about what gentrification means, what the development means, and what it means for them to no longer be able to afford their housing. And I mean, on some level, I am very interested in who's going to pay $2,500 a month to live in Ybor City when there's not a grocery store that's readily available or parking. So
Yeah.
it is something that's happening for someone else. When I'm thinking about the sites that are going up, the city and those who are essential to get things approved are really supportive of the project. I think it's about finding the people who are interested in that form of memory and community outreach and investing in that, because it's a bit different than perhaps what you're going to see when you're thinking about a county commission or the city council. And
Mm-hmm.
technically, all this is approved by the city council and the county commission at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I have been overall surprised that there is a sense of eagerness to talk about it, not resistance. And people have been giving, one of the things when I was talking to Gabby at the beginning of the process were all the things that I've been given by different people. So if I'm thinking like ethically, one of the things I want to make sure is that everything's archived at USF, not
Mm.
just, living on a website. What does it mean for people to continue to be able to share and live and be a part of memory making? But yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you for the opportunity to join us today to hear this amazing work that is happening with archives and digital humanities across the nation. Yes, we're very happy to have had this opportunity to share this with you. We'll have another session tomorrow. This year we gave 7 awards or 8 awards. I don't remember. Lore, remind me. But we'll have the last speaker. 7. 7. It's the end of the awards for us for this term. Our grant is ending this year, but we are working incredibly hard to get more funds so that we can continue to provide this support. And so, if you can join us tomorrow, we'd be happy to see you. And if not, please, we invite you to please continue to support us. Remember, we are a nonprofit publishing house, so if you buy our books, we get to produce more books. We get to fund more literature projects, more research programs, and also to tweet, to share. I'm saying tweet, but X about our work, or Blue. What is it? What is a new Blue Sky? I don't remember which is the platform. Hold each other close. I know we're facing some difficult times, but we continue to do the work. We continue to pull up our sleeves and do the work that needs to be done. So Thank you very much. Nos estamos viendo entonces. Hasta luego.
Bye.
Bye.
Gracias. Adiós.
Bye.